Dr. Merritt Chip-Schreiber is professor of clinical pediatrics in the Department of Pediatrics at Harvard, UCLA. He also serves as the lead for the mental health work group for RAPM and co-lead for the mental health domain for the PPN. And also accompanying him at the end is Tona McGuire, who is the co-lead for behavioral health strike team for the Washington State Department of Health and is also very active in RAPM. Take it away, Dr. Schreiber.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having us. I'm presenting actually a slide deck from my other job, which is at the National Center for Child Traumatic Stress in the Department of Psychiatry at UCLA Health. We'll make a version of these slides stripped of some of the more sensitive stuff after the presentation. I think you covered who I am, essentially a responder by heart. I think some of the ideas we're going to present are hopefully challenging to maybe think through better ways to improve mental health, pediatric mental health, and the mental health of those that take care of kids and their families. So there's lots of fears. Today we're talking chemical. It could be something else, natural disaster, intentional. Definitely the CBRN events, they definitely create an increased level of risk for a longer period of time. And this is from my former unit at DOD. I don't know who did this, one of the generals in Joint Task Force Civil Support, looking at some of the scenario expectations that they have. So, they're the last court of resort in ESF 8. They're part of the catastrophic incident response federally and in a lot of areas. But if you look at what they assume from sort of a mix of CBRN scenarios, they're talking about contamination, they're talking about deaths, casualties, 4 times the number of deaths. Then the casualties would exceed by 4 times the casualties. And then if you look at the mental health, it's 3 to 5 times as great as the medical casualties. So definitely they seem to get it. How come the rest of the civilian mental health system historically hasn't understood kind of that level and magnitude order of impact? That's kind of a question. What we know after these sorts of events is it's one size does not fit all. There's not one outcome. Not everybody's resilient. Neither is everybody going to get something like PTSD or prolonged grief disorder or depression. Usually those are a mix when they emerge. There's also something called MUPS, the kind of there in the middle, which is multiple unexplained physical symptoms. And we'll get to why that's kind of the preferred terminology, even though it's not an easy to use word or readily understood. The take home from this is there's a continuum of resilience and there's a continuum of risk. And when we start to plan for the mental health impacts on kids and families and those that care for them, we need to acknowledge this kind of this continuum of impact. And there's the kind of the MUPS. And associated with the level of risk are appropriate evidence-based interventions. Psych first aid is not a solution set for higher risk individuals. And in a chem bio context, you're going to see the skew toward the yellow, the red, and the purple versus the green. So are you ready for that? If you're not, that's kind of why Tona and I and Trevor and the PPN mental health group, were devised to kind of help those that care for kids physically to think through kind of the mental health impact. So we've thought this through at some length. We've located interventions at each one of these risk levels. Myself in California through schools, in Washington State through the Seattle Children's ED, Pediatric Primary Care in Schools. Tona's done this at scale. All telebehavioral health can be done. We also have a range of psych first aid. That's the place maybe where you start. It's definitely not the place where you end. And many of these resources there's no charge. The little Listen, Protect, and Connect little booklet is on ready.gov. You can give that to parents if nothing else. We have a train the trainer guide. We have a set of slides. We have a wallet card. AAP, some members of AAP use this model to highlight because it's trained to parents and community members in under 75 minutes. And it's on Asper, Tracy, it's lots of places. We also have resources for responder wellness and risk and resilience, and we could also make those available. So it's really important that we identify risk. So this is the National Biodefense Science Board. This was commissioned by a presidential Homeland Security directive. It's a really wonderful document. I can send you the whole thing, But basically, we need to know what the level of impact is, both at the individual level and at the population level, so that we can manage the complex effects, especially in a CBRN event. And they elected to add some really wonderful examples, some things that CDC has on an everyday basis, the behavioral risk surveillance system, kind of the kid version, the YBRS, some stuff from the National Hospital Discharge, the National Health Interview. SANSA has a National Household Survey. It was heavily utilized during COVID, and they outlined at the time two of our mental health triage systems. There's a wonderful policy statement from AAP. And on the risk communications, we'll get to more of this later. I served on the HHS Emergency Public Information and Communication Advisory Board. I also developed a strategy for California related to pandemic planning, but also cuts across the CBRN types. And it's really about individual coping with very, very complex, highly evolving and changing health information related to an invisible release of something. It could be a natural thing like a pandemic, or it could be intentional or accidental release of chemical agents. So without getting into the weeds on these are documents that are also available. What are some of the big implications from mass casualty events that would involve ChemBio or RAD? The settings where folks are going to present are not mental health. The primary concerns and services, of course, are not going to be mental health. There's a critical linkage between mental health, behavior, and risk communication. And really, fear, if you think about it, is contagious independent of what the actual incident is. We're going to have TV, we're going to have rumors, we're going to have confusion about the vectors themselves. In the post-COVID world, the whole idea of vaccination, unfortunately, has been heavily politicized, and stay-at-home orders, and all of that is even now worse than even when this slide was originally developed. We think early identification at risk reduces the mental health impact, and critically, you may not care at all about mental health and children's mental health. I don't think that's the case. But if you care about surge in your setting, the degree to which we manage the mental health impact, especially on parents, is going to, I think, have a direct correlation to the amount of surge and your ability to function in a highly evolving, complex, invisible plume kind of situation. Traditional risk communication to me are very content-based. They don't deal anything, very little with the emotional side of it, the behavioral side of it, complete disconnect. Israel's done a wonderful job. This is actually from a babysitter's training, where the babysitter is taught on how to, get the kid into protective care, how to actually administer the auto injectors, as Dr. Goldberg was showing you. I don't know if you could see it. I brought my own auto injector here just in case something happens while we're talking. The idea is to inspire preparedness without panic. And, it's this is kind of the challenge. What's unique about WMD events, chem in particular, related to mental health? So kids somatize in response to stress, all the time. And that makes it very complicated to know, especially early on in the event, maybe when the agent hasn't been identified. There could be more than one agent involved. They have a varying capacity to verbalize, of course, and may be more vulnerable to injury and death, depending on the agent, harder to treat due to their respiration, their proximity to the ground, surface to mass ratio, complexities, and decontamination. The whole business of, the National Pediatric Preparedness Effort, EMSC equipment, Dr. Marianne Gauchy-Hill and others of you, have been kind of leading this. This is a key issue. They are also more prone to what I would call mass psychological reaction. So, there's this thing called the worried well. Sometimes we get asked to talk about the worried well. Well, the first thing is the worry doesn't have the same proximity as to the actual threat. There's no ground zero. There can be an extended trajectory. We know that novel agents involve dread and horrific death. And that really fuels the whole dread business. There's, again, confusion about exposure, about transmission, contagion, plumes. Should I go? Should I stay? You do one thing in chemical, another thing in RAD. That's hard to communicate to the public, unless you're drilling it all the time. So the worried well, the reality is they're actually not so well. So we need to get a better term. For one thing, it's stigmatizing and minimizing. It really promotes further disconnect from the citizenry. HHS a number of years ago suggested using the words people concerned about exposure, that just has not caught on. But forget the touchy-feely part of it. It's really about surgeon adherence. Do you want people in the public to follow the guidance you want? And that's more than just telling them where to go and what to do. It's acknowledging fear and dread, which can be we know that, parents in particular, this is from a radiation event from Chernobyl, that the first responders into the radiation area, the containment vessel, and the moms of kids under 11 were the highest risk over time. Following a radiological event, this is an example in Brazil, that was not an intentional release. It was kids that got a hold of some medical grade radiation materials that were left behind after a facility was moved. 244 were contaminated, 54 were treated, 34 were treated, subsequently released, 20 hospitalized, and it required 125,000 to be screened in a 12-day period. There were 5,000 out of the 60,000 that had some sort of symptom, but none where their actual exposure wasn't aerosolized, was actually confirmed. So you've got people actually with some kind of non-specific symptomatology, in this case, a rash, that actually could not have been exposed to the actual agent of concern. In a aerosolized release, that's impossible to even know, early on. And the mental health follow-up showed that those with low-level exposure and those concerned without exposure actually had similar long-term somatic and mental health symptoms. So the worried well aren't well. We need a better word. For little kids, it's really, how parents are doing. In chemicals, they pose a significant risk. There's concern about evolving agents, Gen 4, Gen 5, fentanyl itself, and the various, emerging substrates of fentanyl. That's also a concern. There's also an overlap between low-level nerve agent exposure and anxiety and increased arousal symptoms. Very hard to know for the low. Obviously, somebody, at high exposure, that's different. And in the sarin attack, I think you've heard something about that. Hopefully I'll have time to show you a 30-second slide. Fourth of the 5,000 people that surged EDs in the first 96 hours had no exposure. And this is a lot where the worried well terminology came from. They were concerned. They went to the ED looking for nerve agent or other timely interventions. And, the closest ED actually had a surge of 700 patients, 62 minutes, St. Luke's. 46% of those in the sarin attack had significant PTSD. This is for anyone that was kind of in the subway where the release occurred. So again, the worried well, most of them, although they were in the proximity, didn't really have any symptomatology. They can present with MUFs with symptoms that mimic the real thing, especially at lower dose levels, but the cause isn't medical, and they definitely add to surge. In the Scud attacks, those were, after the Gulf War, Iraq was shooting these missiles that supposedly had chemical warheads with Gen 2 nerve agents on top. They actually had 773 ED visits tied to the Scuds. They estimate 43% of those visits were, quote, psychological in nature for the adults. 230 of the admits were for inappropriate auto injectors. So in Israel, in certain cities, they actually give the population auto injectors in advance. 40 were injured from trying to rush to safety. And of the 11 who died, this is horrific, 7 suffocated from respirators that did not remove the covers. So they had auto injectors and they had a respirator, and some died because they didn't remove the respirator. Of those who had to evacuate from the Scuds, 80% had PTSD 1 year later, and very, very poor adherence to all those emergency risk communications. Only 57 to 77 complied with the respirator directions, and it was highly correlated with level of fear. In this case, the moderate level folks with fear actually complied better. You can get PTSD, you can get acute stress disorder, all those comorbidities. There can be massive loss of life, like we're looking at in Maui. We call that traumatic bereavement or prolonged grief disorder. It's not PTSD, it's not depression, it's kind of its own thing. Things that contribute to the mass reactions that folks were causing, we're calling worried well, an invisible agent, the virulence or the toxicity when there's, again, confusion, when there's multiple agencies involved, when the agent itself can mimic or even cause mental disorders like low-dose nerve agents, when there's intense and chronic media exposure. So you heard about methyl isocyanate. I just thought I'd show you an example from some of our previous work with DoD and Northcom. This is not classified. It looks like it would be, but it's not. This is an exercise, large-scale exercise that DoD participated in, actually in one of the RAPM areas. And it was a intentional methyl isocyanate release like Bhopal. And you can basically see the estimations of in the population, how many would be injured using a 10% rate and an injury rate. So you've got 355,000 dead, 869,000 in the yellow plume. The red plume is the death. And then when we take it the next step, look where the hospitals are. I believe that's Harborview is in there. Look how many schools, medical facilities, fire stations, look how many police stations. A lot of the critical infrastructure, if you will, first responder infrastructure in Seattle was in that most intense plume. And then, looking out into the estimated injury plume, this is kind of out a little bit later into the plume. Just think about the mental health impact of what that would look like if that should happen. God forbid it doesn't. This is more recent. This is the actual plume from the chem plant in Rockton. This was actually hydrogen cyanide. And these are going to show up. These are, whether they start out classified or not, they're going to not be classified early on. And these are going to be in the media. And look what happens when you start to show the number of people in the various plume levels. What happens psychologically? This is from the East Palestine, Ohio event. And, people are going to start to place their house. These are smooth curves. These are not exact. They need to be dynamic, accounting for wind trends. When you do these in cities, it doesn't work this smoothly either. There's also a phenomenon of compound events. If this occurs, a chemical release occurs in the context of a terrorist attack, it could be, tied to an explosion. And I'm going to zip through the rest here. We played with this with Red Cross using our triage tool. This was actually a mustard release, part of Top Off 3 in Connecticut, in Groton, Connecticut. So we captured mental health triage in some very large scale evacuation centers that Red Cross facilitated. This is a very, very early exercise. We were able to kind of determine level of impact in those shelters and a family assistance center, the incident site, and then a distant shelter for not directly impacted, but evacuated. We did something similar in Top Off 4. This was actually an RDD. What we simulated here was that the local entity, in this case, Multnomah County, Red Cross, and U.S. Public Health Service operating a federal medical station could all share mental health information real time. We got a proxy out of that. This is from an exercise in LA City that was a chlorine release in a shopping mall. I got to be a exercise. I thought I was an observer watching this. It's actually me looking down from the top part of the mall to the victims. It was FEMA graded. You could see the mop gear there, patient being escorted out. This is actually from JTF Civil Support. This is the 76 OCR. We're very excited that in Rapid Mental Health, we have the command surgeon from the 76 OCR based in Salt Lake that participates with us. He's also a psychiatrist at the University of Utah, adult psychiatrist. And this is from some of their exercises. It looks like they're trying to come to grips with some of the ideas that Dr. Goldberg showed you about rapid decon, including pediatric patients. Would a kid stand there? How'd you like to be the kid? And that's your medical providers. And are you going to get the non-ambulatory or the ambulatory decon? How do we do that with parents and kids? Is there time to show you the actual clip from Sarin, David?
Go ahead, sir.
This is the release, which was in a subway near the center of the governmental structure in Tokyo. The important part comes next because it's going to be at the, you'll notice they didn't know what they had. There's no PPE at all. You'll notice kind of one of the cardinal symptoms of sarin exposure. And now it goes to this is St. Luke's Medical Center, the closest to release site. The entire hospital, I believe, was contaminated. The nursing, the ED physicians, the first responders, a lot of people walk up, taxi cabs, family vehicles. You'll start to hear the sirens, police bringing patients. This is kind of hallmark for large-scale mass casualty. This is a private vehicle. Right. There's a huge risk for responders. We used to think it was 10 to 20% got a new disorder. After 9/11, 15 to 70% of those that responded to the World Trade Center site had probable PTSD. Even 2 to 3 years later, that was about 6,000 of those dedicated responders. And even their kids had secondary mental health impacts, including PTSD and depression. If we expand the criteria beyond literally the PTSD diagnosis and we go subsyndromal, which is the way we usually think about things, it goes to about 45% of that first responder population with those subsyndromal reactions even 10 years later. When it involves a lot of kids, it's worse. And we know that CBRN even worse. There's some examples of that from an event that happened in Europe with an El Al cargo liner. Even 8 years later, no exposure ever documented. The police and fire had elevated somatic concerns, non-specific symptomatology. Here's me in that exercise. I thought I was watching. I was told by this very nice fire department member that I was going to be deconned. That was a little bit of a surprise. So I got to experience a little bit was like I was told to go into this area and remove my clothes. I said no. They said yes. I removed my clothes. Now I'm going to hand it over to my dear colleague, Dr. McGuire.
Thank you, Chip. That was a whirlwind tour through the mental health impacts of CBRN. I am going to very briefly talk about family reunification and the impact of separation on kids. All the presenters prior to this did a great job of talking about the importance, particularly during decontamination, of keeping kids and parents together. But we all know that when we're in the middle of a disaster, we do what we do, and we know that there are going to be children separated from their parents. And so I want to just remind you, because I think when we're in this particular kind of response, especially, we tend to get kind of laser focused in on what has to be done. And that's important. But I would encourage you to kind of step back at that moment and think about this from a trauma-informed lens. And that would include things like just recognizing that some of the children who may be separated and coming through being treated may have a history of pre-existing trauma. If they're refugee children, they may have had extensive trauma histories trying to get to wherever they are at that point in time. And there are kids who are going to have pre-existing mental health conditions, including trauma exposure, that are going to show up as well, that may not look like, let's say, a refugee child from another country, but has a similar history and needing to be considered around that. Kids who have diagnosis such as a separation anxiety disorder and anxiety disorder in general, all of those children are at higher risk. As Chip pointed out, just the notion of the experience of being separated from caregivers, even if eventually there's reunification, is of itself a trauma exposure that increases the risk for post-traumatic stress disorder for all of these children. So I would like you to consider approaching every child that comes in an event like this from a trauma-informed perspective, taking a breath yourself and recognizing that these may already be injured children in terms of psychological impact coming in. Also to consider developmental and neurodevelopmental considerations, children with autism who have often high sensory issues and anxiety, children with developmental delays, and other sorts of special needs. So I'm going to stop there because I think we're out of time. There are some resources on this slide that are available to you in terms of reunification and the impact on kids, and I would encourage you to take a look at them. End of report.
Thank you both very, very much. We unfortunately don't have time for questions, but please email to us or once you get the presentation materials, reach out to the folks whose contact information is part of each presentation.